You won't believe how these legendary figures shaped the outcome of the Civil War and changed American history forever. April 12, 1861. The first cannon shot rang out over Charleston Harbor, and with it, a nation was torn apart. What began as a conflict between North and South quickly escalated into one of the deadliest wars in American history. Over 4 years, thousands of battles raged across the country, from small skirmishes in forgotten fields to massive clashes that would decide the fate of a divided nation. These battles were more than just military engagements. They were turning points that shaped history. Strategies were tested, generals rose to fame, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers gave their lives on the battlefield. Some of these fights changed the course of the war entirely, while others became symbols of the struggle that defined an era. Today, we journey back to the blood-stained fields of the 1860s to relive the most pivotal battles of the Civil War. From the chaos of Bull Run to the brutal siege of Vicksburg and the fateful stand at Gettysburg, we uncover the stories behind the clashes that shaped America forever. The Gathering Storm. The American Civil War was more than a conflict of muskets and cannons. It was a battle of ideologies, economies, and leadership. The years leading up to the war were marked by growing tensions between the industrialized North and the agrarian South, culminating in the secession of 11 states from the Union. With the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, the final fracture in the fragile national unity was complete. The Confederacy, under Jefferson Davis, sought to preserve what they saw as their way of life, while the Union fought to maintain the integrity of the United States. As the war began, the battlefield would become a proving ground for some of the greatest military minds in American history. The North held an advantage in population, industry, and resources, yet the South countered with brilliant leadership, defensive strategies, and an unparalleled fighting spirit. It would be the decisions of these men, their victories, failures, and adaptability, that would determine the fate of a divided nation. Act 1. The leaders of the nations at war. Abraham Lincoln, the steadfast commander-in-chief. Abraham Lincoln stands as one of the most revered figures in American history, a leader whose vision and determination steered the United States through its most turbulent era, the Civil War. Born on February 12, 1809, in a small log cabin in Kentucky, Lincoln's rise from humble beginnings to the highest office in the nation is a testament to his perseverance, intellect, and moral conviction. Early life and path to politics. Lincoln's early years were marked by hardship. Growing up in the frontier regions of Kentucky and Indiana, he had limited formal education, but he was an avid reader and largely self-taught. His early experiences with manual labor, particularly splitting logs and farming, earned him the nickname the Rail Splitter. Despite his humble start, he developed a deep passion for law and politics. By the 1830s, Lincoln had moved to Illinois, where he launched his political career, serving in the state legislature and later becoming a lawyer. His ability to simplify complex legal and political issues, coupled with his keen sense of humor and storytelling, quickly made him a respected figure in the legal community. However, it was his opposition to the expansion of slavery that would define his political ideology and propel him onto the national stage. The road to the presidency. Lincoln gained national recognition during the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, where he challenged Senator Stephen A. Douglas on the issue of slavery. Though he lost the Senate race, his arguments against the expansion of slavery and his assertion that the nation could not remain half slave and half free resonated with many. 2 years later, in 1860, he was elected as the 16th President of the United States under the newly formed Republican Party. His election, however, was met with immediate resistance from Southern states, many of which saw his presidency as a direct threat to their way of life. Before he could even take office, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. By April 1861, with the attack on Fort Sumter, the Civil War had begun. Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War. Leading a divided nation through its bloodiest conflict was an immense challenge. Lincoln faced opposition not just from the Confederacy, but also within his own government. He was often criticized for his handling of the war and struggled to find capable military leaders early on. However, he remained steadfast in his commitment to preserving the Union, understanding that the war was not just about reuniting the states, but also about the fundamental principles of democracy and human rights. One of Lincoln's most defining moments came on January 1, 1863, with the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. While it did not immediately free all enslaved people, it declared freedom for those in Confederate-held territories and changed the nature of the war from a battle to preserve the Union into a fight for human liberation. This not only strengthened the moral cause of the Union, but also discouraged European powers from recognizing the Confederacy. Throughout the war, Lincoln also expanded the power of the presidency, making unprecedented use of executive authority. He suspended habeas corpus in certain areas, implemented the first federal draft, and worked tirelessly to maintain political support for the war effort. His ability to communicate through powerful speeches and personal letters helped him connect with the American people, keeping morale high even during the darkest moments of the conflict. Gettysburg Address and Vision for the Future. Perhaps Lincoln's most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, delivered in November 1863, exemplified his ability to convey profound ideas in simple yet powerful language. In just a few minutes, he reaffirmed the principles upon which the nation was founded, emphasizing that the Civil War was a test of whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people would survive. His words continue to resonate as one of the most eloquent defenses of democracy in history. As the war neared its conclusion, Lincoln focused on reunifying the country. His second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, called for healing rather than retribution, urging Americans to move forward, with malice toward none, with charity for all. His vision was not just to end the war, but to rebuild a stronger, more unified nation, one that could fulfill the promise of equality and freedom. Assassination and legacy. Tragically, Lincoln would not live to see his vision fully realized. On April 14, 1865, just days after General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater. His death sent shockwaves through the nation, and he became a martyr for the cause of liberty and union. Today, Lincoln's legacy endures as one of the greatest presidents in American history. His leadership during the Civil War, his commitment to ending slavery, and his ability to inspire through words and actions cemented his place in history. From the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., to his countless quotes etched in textbooks and speeches, his influence remains a guiding light for democracy, justice, and unity. Few leaders have faced such extraordinary challenges, and even fewer have met them with the wisdom, humility, and moral clarity of Abraham Lincoln. His presidency was not just about winning a war. It was about defining what America stood for and ensuring that government by the people would never perish from the earth. Early struggles with commanders. From the outset of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln faced significant challenges in finding a commanding general who could effectively lead the Union Army to victory. His initial choices often proved disappointing, either due to a lack of aggression, poor strategic decision-making, or an inability to inspire confidence among their troops. One of Lincoln's earliest appointments, General George B. McClellan, showed great promise. A gifted organizer and tactician, McClellan played a crucial role in rebuilding the Union Army after its disastrous defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. Under his leadership, the Army of the Potomac became a well-trained and disciplined force. However, despite his strengths in logistics and preparation, McClellan was notoriously cautious to a fault. Time and again, he hesitated to commit his troops to battle, convinced that he was outnumbered, even when Union intelligence suggested otherwise. His slow, methodical approach frustrated Lincoln, who grew increasingly impatient with McClellan's reluctance to aggressively pursue Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The tension between Lincoln and McClellan came to a head during the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, a grand offensive aimed at capturing Richmond, the Confederate capital. Instead of pressing his advantage, McClellan overestimated enemy strength and delayed action, allowing Lee to outmaneuver him. Following his failure to deliver a decisive victory at the Battle of Antietam, despite having superior numbers, Lincoln relieved McClellan of command in November 1862, a decision that marked a turning point in the search for effective leadership. McClellan's replacement, General Ambrose Burnside, was a stark contrast, aggressive but recklessly so. Burnside took command in late 1862 and immediately launched the Fredericksburg Campaign, hoping to seize the initiative before winter set in. However, his poorly planned and executed assault on Confederate fortifications at Fredericksburg in December 1862 led to a crushing Union defeat, with over 12,000 casualties. The debacle left his troops demoralized and Lincoln deeply frustrated. Recognizing Burnside's lack of strategic vision, Lincoln replaced him after just a few months. The next man to take the reins, General Joseph Hooker, entered the role with confidence, even boasting that he would achieve decisive victories where his predecessors had failed. Hooker restructured the army effectively, improving morale and logistics. But when it came time to face Lee directly in the Chancellorsville Campaign of May 1863, his overconfidence proved disastrous. Lee, though outnumbered, executed a bold flanking maneuver with General Stonewall Jackson, completely disrupting Hooker's battle lines. The Union forces suffered another humiliating defeat, and despite Lincoln's initial faith in Hooker, it became clear that he, too, lacked the ability to decisively defeat Lee on the battlefield. These early struggles exposed the Union's dire need for a commander who could match Lee's battlefield prowess, not just in organization or strategy, but in execution and adaptability. Lincoln's repeated disappointments underscored the difficulty of war leadership and set the stage for the rise of more aggressive generals like George Meade and ultimately Ulysses S. Grant, who would finally turn the tide in the Union's favor. The Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, was a pivotal moment in American history, demonstrating President Abraham Lincoln's evolving stance on slavery and redefining the Civil War's objectives. While Lincoln initially framed the war as a struggle to preserve the Union, he gradually recognized that undermining the institution of slavery was essential to achieving lasting peace and national unity. Issued on January 1, 1863, the proclamation declared that enslaved people in Confederate-controlled territories were henceforth free. Although it did not immediately liberate all enslaved individuals, since it did not apply to border states or areas already under Union control, it fundamentally altered the war's purpose. The conflict was no longer just about reuniting the country. It became a fight for human freedom. This shift had significant diplomatic consequences. European nations, particularly Britain and France, had considered recognizing the Confederacy due to economic ties, especially in cotton trade. However, both nations had abolished slavery decades earlier, and Lincoln's decision reframed the war as a moral struggle against slavery. This made it politically untenable for them to support the Confederacy without contradicting their own anti-slavery principles, ultimately discouraging foreign intervention. The proclamation also had a profound impact on the Union's military strategy. By allowing African Americans to enlist in the Union Army, it expanded the pool of available soldiers, strengthening the North's war effort. Approximately 180,000 black soldiers served in the Union Army by the war's end, proving vital to securing victory. Their participation challenged racist notions that had justified slavery and demonstrated the capability and bravery of African Americans in battle. While the Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately end slavery nationwide, it laid the foundation for the 13th Amendment, which would formally abolish slavery in 1865. It was a bold wartime measure that reshaped the course of American history, reinforcing the principle that the nation could not survive half free and half slave. Lincoln's decision ensured that the Civil War's legacy would be not just about preserving the Union, but about advancing the cause of human rights. The Gettysburg Address, 1863, delivered on November 19, 1863, at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, President Abraham Lincoln's speech transformed the American Civil War's significance in just 272 words. Speaking on the same battlefield where Union and Confederate forces had fought one of the war's deadliest encounters for months earlier, Lincoln used the occasion not merely to honor the fallen, but to redefine the war's ultimate purpose. Lincoln opened by referencing the nation's founding in 1776, invoking the Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal. By doing so, he reminded his audience that the war was not just a struggle to preserve the Union, but also a fight to uphold the fundamental ideals upon which the United States was built. He acknowledged the immense sacrifices made by soldiers on both sides, stating that their devotion had consecrated the battlefield far beyond what words ever could. His speech subtly countered the idea that the war was solely about states' rights, instead reinforcing the notion that it was about ensuring that a nation built on democracy and freedom could endure. The most famous passage of the speech, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth," served as a powerful reaffirmation of democratic governance, emphasizing that the survival of the Union was essential to the broader experiment of self-rule. Lincoln's address, though brief, profoundly influenced American political thought, shaping how the Civil War and the nation's founding ideals were remembered. Over time, the Gettysburg Address has become one of the most revered speeches in U.S. history, celebrated for its eloquence, brevity, and timeless call for national unity and democratic resilience. Unlike his predecessors, Ulysses S. Grant embraced a strategy of continuous engagement, understanding that the Union's superior resources and manpower could outlast the Confederacy in a war of attrition. While earlier generals, such as George McClellan and Henry Halleck, had been overly cautious or hesitant to commit fully to battle, Grant pressed forward relentlessly, even in the face of staggering casualties. His campaigns, including the brutal Overland Campaign of 1864, demonstrated his willingness to endure heavy losses to wear down Confederate forces. Despite concerns from critics about the high cost in lives, Lincoln recognized Grant's determination as essential to achieving ultimate victory. Trusting in Grant's ability to deliver results where others had faltered, Lincoln refused to waver in his support. His faith was rewarded as Grant's relentless offensives forced Robert E. Lee into a defensive posture, leading to the eventual surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, securing the Union's triumph in the Civil War. Jefferson Davis, the struggling president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator from Mississippi and Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce, faced overwhelming challenges as the leader of the Confederate States of America. Unlike Abraham Lincoln, who excelled in uniting the North through political maneuvering and strategic leadership, Davis struggled with internal divisions, a lack of resources, and a military strategy that often put the Confederacy on the defensive. His tenure as Confederate president was marked by difficult decisions, strained relationships with his generals, and an increasing sense of desperation as the war turned against the South. Challenges in military strategy. Davis, a West Point graduate and veteran of the Mexican-American War, initially held high hopes for the South's military success. However, his insistence on personally managing military affairs often led to tensions with his commanders. He favored a defensive strategy, believing the Confederacy could win by holding territory and outlasting Northern resolve. This approach clashed with the views of several of his top generals, particularly Joseph E. Johnston, who preferred strategic withdrawals to preserve Confederate forces. Davis's tendency to micromanage military operations became a liability. He frequently overruled his generals, appointed officers based on loyalty rather than ability, and remained steadfast in his support of leaders like Braxton Bragg despite their failures on the battlefield. His strained relationship with key figures, including Johnston and even Robert E. Lee at times, contributed to missed opportunities and strategic blunders. Struggles with resources and foreign relations. One of Davis's greatest struggles was securing the resources necessary to sustain the Confederacy. Unlike the industrialized North, the South lacked significant manufacturing capabilities, a well-developed railroad system, and a large population to sustain prolonged warfare. While the Confederacy had an economy based on cotton exports, Davis's belief that King Cotton would compel Britain and France to intervene proved misguided. The Union's naval blockade, combined with Britain's reliance on alternative cotton sources like India and Egypt, meant that foreign recognition never came. Internally, Davis faced opposition from Southern governors who resisted his efforts to centralize authority. The Confederate government struggled to implement effective taxation, and inflation soared as the war dragged on. The lack of a cohesive economic strategy, combined with food shortages and widespread desertions, weakened morale both on the battlefield and the home front. The fall of the Confederacy. By 1864, the Union, under Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, was systematically dismantling the South's ability to continue fighting. Sherman's march to the sea devastated the Confederacy's infrastructure, while Grant's relentless campaigns in Virginia forced Lee's army into a defensive retreat. Davis, still believing in a final victory, refused to acknowledge the inevitable collapse of the Confederacy. In April 1865, with Richmond under siege, Davis and his government abandoned the Confederate capital. As Union forces captured more territory, Davis attempted to regroup in hopes of continuing the fight from the Deep South. However, on May 10, 1865, he was captured by Union troops in Georgia. Imprisoned for 2 years at Fort Monroe, Davis never stood trial for treason but remained a controversial figure in American history. Conclusion: Jefferson Davis's leadership was marked by his unwavering commitment to the Confederate cause, but his inability to unify his government, manage military affairs effectively, and secure foreign intervention contributed to the South's downfall. Unlike Lincoln, who adapted and evolved as a wartime leader, Davis remained rigid in his approach, struggling to maintain control as the Confederacy unraveled. His presidency serves as a case study in the difficulties of leadership during a crisis, where strategic flexibility and political skill often determine the fate of a nation. Act 2. The Union Generals, the Struggle for Victory. Ulysses S. Grant, the unyielding commander. Ulysses S. Grant emerged from relative obscurity to become the Union's most effective general, ultimately leading all Union forces to victory in the Civil War. His leadership was marked by determination, strategic brilliance, and an ability to endure setbacks while maintaining relentless pressure on the Confederacy. Early successes: Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, February 1862. In the early months of 1862, Grant launched a bold offensive in the Western Theater, securing crucial victories at Fort Henry, February 6, 1862, and Fort Donelson, February 16, 1862. These twin triumphs provided the Union with control over the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, essential waterways for military movement and supply lines. The capture of Fort Donelson also marked Grant's emergence as a formidable leader, as he earned the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant due to his refusal to negotiate surrender terms with the Confederates. The Battle of Shiloh, April 6 to 7, 1862, a test of resolve. The Battle of Shiloh, fought in southwestern Tennessee, was one of the bloodiest encounters of the war up to that point. On April 6, Confederate forces launched a surprise attack, catching Grant's troops off guard near the Tennessee River. Despite suffering heavy losses and being pushed back on the first day, Grant, along with reinforcements from General Buell's Army of the Ohio, counterattacked on April 7, driving the Confederates into retreat. The battle resulted in over 23,000 casualties, shocking both the North and South with its scale of destruction. While criticized for being unprepared, Grant demonstrated resilience under pressure, reinforcing his reputation as an unshakable leader. The Siege of Vicksburg, May 18 to July 4, 1863, the key to the Mississippi. Grant's campaign against Vicksburg, Mississippi, was a masterclass in strategic maneuvering. Recognizing the city's significance as the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River, Grant executed a series of bold flanking movements, cutting off the city's supplies and laying siege for 47 days. Facing starvation and relentless bombardment, the Confederate defenders, led by General John Pemberton, surrendered on July 4, 1863. This victory, coupled with General Meade's success at Gettysburg just a day earlier, marked a turning point in the war, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and giving the Union total control of the Mississippi River. The Overland Campaign, May-June 1860, for the War of Attrition. After being appointed Lieutenant General of all Union forces in March 1864, Grant shifted his focus to the Eastern Theater, engaging in a series of brutal battles against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Known as the Overland Campaign, this relentless offensive included major clashes at the Wilderness, May 5 to 7, Spotsylvania Courthouse, May 8 to 21, and Cold Harbor, May 31 to June 12. Unlike previous Union commanders, Grant refused to retreat after suffering heavy casualties, recognizing that the Union's numerical and logistical superiority would eventually wear down Lee's army. Though costly in lives, nearly 55,000 Union casualties, the campaign forced Lee into a defensive position around Richmond and Petersburg, setting the stage for the war's final phase. Victory at Appomattox, April 9, 1865. The war's end and a gracious surrender. After months of relentless siege warfare at Petersburg, Lee's forces, weakened by desertion and dwindling supplies, made a final desperate attempt to escape westward. Grant pursued aggressively, finally surrounding Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered, effectively bringing the Civil War to a close. In a remarkable display of magnanimity, Grant offered generous terms, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and sidearms, helping to pave the way for reconciliation rather than further resentment. Legacy: a commander who delivered victory. Grant's leadership in the Civil War was defined by his tenacity, strategic innovation, and ability to recover from setbacks. Unlike many of his predecessors, he understood that victory required constant pressure and was willing to endure staggering losses to achieve the ultimate goal. His success in both the Western and Eastern theaters proved his adaptability and decisiveness, making him the Union's indispensable military leader. His rise from a struggling former officer to the most celebrated general of his time remains one of the most remarkable stories in American military history. William Tecumseh Sherman, the master of total war. Few military leaders have left as profound an impact on warfare as General William Tecumseh Sherman. A key figure in the Union Army during the American Civil War, Sherman revolutionized military strategy through his application of total war, a doctrine that targeted not just enemy armies, but also the economic and logistical infrastructure that sustained them. His campaigns were marked by bold maneuvers, relentless offensives, and a ruthless efficiency that hastened the Confederacy's collapse. The Atlanta Campaign, May-September 1864. Sherman's push into the Deep South began with the Atlanta Campaign, a series of hard-fought battles against Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston and later John Bell Hood. Using a combination of flanking maneuvers and relentless pressure, Sherman forced the Confederates to retreat from key defensive positions. After months of grueling engagements at Resaca, Kennesaw Mountain, and Peachtree Creek, his army captured Atlanta on September 2, 1864. The fall of this vital industrial and railroad hub dealt a crushing blow to the Confederacy and played a decisive role in securing President Abraham Lincoln's re-election, ensuring the continuation of the war effort. The March to the Sea, November-December 1864. With Atlanta in Union hands, Sherman turned his focus to Georgia's heartland. Rather than pursuing a traditional military engagement, he launched one of the most infamous scorched earth campaigns in history. His 62,000-strong army abandoned supply lines and lived off the land, systematically destroying railroads, plantations, factories, and anything that could support the Confederate war effort. By the time he reached Savannah in December 1864, his troops had left a 300-mile swath of destruction that crippled the South's ability to resist. The psychological impact was just as devastating. Southern morale plummeted, and Confederate forces struggled to regroup in the face of such overwhelming devastation. The Carolinas Campaign, January-April 1865. Determined to finish what he started, Sherman pressed northward into South Carolina and North Carolina in early 1865. South Carolina, the birthplace of secession, suffered particularly brutal treatment as Union soldiers razed towns, dismantled railroads, and burned supplies. His forces overran Confederate defenses at battles such as Averysboro and Bentonville, preventing any last-ditch Confederate efforts to regroup. By April, his relentless advance had effectively destroyed the remaining Confederate infrastructure, forcing General Joseph E. Johnston to surrender in North Carolina, one of the final major surrenders of the war, coming just weeks after Lee's capitulation at Appomattox. The legacy of Sherman's total war. Sherman's strategies changed the course of modern warfare. His belief in targeting civilian infrastructure, while controversial, became a model for future conflicts. His campaigns demonstrated the power of psychological warfare, proving that breaking an enemy's will to fight could be just as decisive as battlefield victories. Though reviled in the South, Sherman's tactics hastened the end of the Civil War, preserving the Union and reshaping military strategy for generations to come. George Meade, the defender of Gettysburg. Background and leadership. George Gordon Meade, a career military officer and engineer, was appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac just 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg in late June 1863. Replacing General Joseph Hooker, Meade inherited an army in disarray as it attempted to track and counter Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, which had launched its second invasion of the North. Meade was known for his meticulous planning, strong defensive tactics, and cool-headed leadership under pressure. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 1 to 3, 1863. As Lee's forces advanced into Pennsylvania, Meade swiftly organized his army along a defensive position centered on the town of Gettysburg. His choice to establish a stronghold along Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill created a natural defensive advantage. July 1, 1863. The battle began as Confederate forces engaged Union troops northwest of Gettysburg. Meade was not present on the battlefield that day, but ordered his army to concentrate in the area. Union forces, under General John Reynolds and later General Winfield S. Hancock, managed to hold key defensive positions despite early Confederate gains. July 2, 1863. Lee launched a series of fierce assaults against the Union flanks, particularly at Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, and Devil's Den. Meade skillfully reinforced key positions, ensuring that the Union lines remained intact. July 3, 1863. The climax of the battle came with Pickett's charge, Lee's final, desperate attempt to break the Union center. Meade's well-positioned artillery and infantry repulsed the assault, inflicting catastrophic losses on the Confederates. By the evening of July 3, it was clear that Lee's invasion had failed. The Confederate Army, having suffered heavy casualties, was forced to retreat. Meade's decision not to aggressively pursue Lee. Despite securing a decisive victory, Meade faced criticism for failing to aggressively pursue Lee's retreating army. While President Abraham Lincoln and others believed that Meade had missed an opportunity to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia, several key factors influenced his decision. Exhaustion and heavy losses. The Army of the Potomac had suffered nearly 23,000 casualties, significantly reducing its offensive capability. Logistical challenges. Meade's army required time to reorganize, resupply, and reinforce after 3 days of intense combat. Lee's strong defensive position. As Lee withdrew across the Potomac River, he positioned his army behind natural defensive barriers, making an immediate attack highly risky. Although Meade did order limited pursuit operations, Lee managed to escape into Virginia by mid-July, allowing the war to continue for nearly 2 more years. Legacy and impact. Meade's leadership at Gettysburg was crucial in halting Confederate momentum and preventing a possible Southern victory on Union soil. However, his reputation was somewhat overshadowed by his lack of aggressive pursuit and the later rise of Ulysses S. Grant, who took command of all Union armies in 1864. While he never received the same level of fame as Grant or William T. Sherman, Meade's role as the defender of Gettysburg remains one of the most significant contributions to the Union war effort. His defensive strategy at Gettysburg ensured that Lee's invasion was repelled, marking a major turning point in the Civil War. Philip Sheridan, the cavalry commander. Shenandoah Valley Campaign, 1864. Philip Sheridan played a pivotal role in the Union Army's success during the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864, a crucial operation aimed at crippling the Confederacy's ability to sustain its war effort. The Shenandoah Valley, often referred to as the breadbasket of the Confederacy, was a vital agricultural and logistical hub for the Southern forces. It provided essential food supplies, livestock, and a strategic corridor for troop movements. Sheridan, appointed by Ulysses S. Grant to lead the Army of the Shenandoah, executed a series of decisive battles against Confederate General Jubal Early. His aggressive tactics and relentless pursuit of the enemy resulted in key victories at the battles of 3rd Winchester, Fisher's Hill, and Cedar Creek. These engagements not only routed Early's forces but also destroyed critical Confederate infrastructure, including railroads, mills, and barns stocked with provisions. A defining feature of Sheridan's campaign was his use of scorched earth tactics, known as the burning, in which his troops systematically destroyed farms, crops, and supply depots. This strategy severely weakened the Confederacy's ability to sustain its armies and contributed to the eventual collapse of the Southern war effort. Sheridan's leadership in the Shenandoah Valley solidified his reputation as one of the Union's most effective cavalry commanders. His victories denied the Confederacy vital resources, prevented further raids into Union territory, and bolstered Northern morale at a crucial stage of the war. George H. Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. Battle of Nashville, December 15 to 16, 1864. General George H. Thomas orchestrated one of the most decisive Union victories of the Civil War at the Battle of Nashville. Following the Confederate Army of Tennessee's advance into Tennessee under General John Bell Hood, Thomas meticulously prepared his forces for a counteroffensive. Despite pressure from Washington to act quickly, he refused to move until his troops were fully equipped and weather conditions were favorable. When he finally struck on December 15th, his well-coordinated assault shattered Hood's defensive lines. The following day, Union forces launched a relentless attack, breaking the Confederate flanks and forcing a full-scale retreat. Thomas's victory was overwhelming. The Confederate Army of Tennessee ceased to be an effective fighting force, suffering massive casualties and disintegrating as it fled southward. This battle effectively ended large-scale Confederate operations in the Western Theater and solidified Thomas's reputation as one of the Union's most capable generals. Act 3. The Confederate Generals Defending the South. Robert E. Lee, the Southern icon. Lee's tactics kept the Confederacy alive despite overwhelming odds. While often outnumbered and outgunned, his ability to read enemy movements, utilize terrain, and inspire his troops made him a formidable commander. However, his aggressive tendencies sometimes led to high-risk decisions that ultimately cost the Confederacy dearly. The 7 Days Battles, June 25 to July 1, 1862, defending Richmond. After taking command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia in June 1862, Lee inherited a dire situation. Union General George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac was within striking distance of Richmond. Instead of staying on the defensive, Lee launched a series of bold, coordinated attacks over 7 days to push McClellan back. Key tactical decisions. Lee's use of aggression. Unlike his predecessor, General Joseph E. Johnston, Lee believed in taking the fight to the enemy. He initiated a counteroffensive despite logistical disadvantages. Jeb Stuart's cavalry raid. Stuart's reconnaissance mission successfully mapped McClellan's right flank, allowing Lee to identify vulnerabilities. Dividing his forces. Lee divided his army to attack Union positions at Mechanicsville, Gaines Mill, and Glendale, forcing McClellan into retreat. Outcome and impact. McClellan abandoned his position and retreated to Harrison's Landing, ending the Peninsula Campaign. Richmond was saved from capture. Lee solidified his reputation as a daring commander, but his inexperienced army suffered heavy casualties due to poorly coordinated attacks. Second Manassas, August 28 to 30, 1862, a masterclass in maneuver warfare. After Richmond's defense, Lee shifted to an offensive strategy, seeking to eliminate Union forces before they could regroup. At Second Manassas, he capitalized on Union General John Pope's aggressive but disjointed movements. Key tactical decisions. Jackson's flanking movement. Lee sent Stonewall Jackson on a daring maneuver behind enemy lines to seize the Union supply depot at Manassas Junction. Baiting Pope into attack, Jackson positioned his troops in a defensive stance along an unfinished railroad cut, drawing Union forces into a costly frontal assault. Longstreet's devastating counterattack. While Pope focused on Jackson, Lee ordered General James Longstreet to launch a massive assault against the Union's left flank, crushing their lines. Outcome and impact. A decisive Confederate victory, forcing the Union Army into retreat toward Washington, D.C. Lee demonstrated his ability to coordinate multiple corps in a complex battle. This victory emboldened Lee to invade the North, leading to the Maryland Campaign and the Battle of Antietam. Gettysburg, July 1 to 3, 1863, the high-water mark of the Confederacy. Lee's second invasion of the North aimed to relieve pressure on the South, gain supplies, and possibly force a political settlement. However, miscommunication, overconfidence, and Union resilience turned Gettysburg into a disaster for the Confederacy. Key tactical missteps. Lack of cavalry intelligence. Lee's cavalry commander, J.B. Stuart, was absent for much of the campaign, leaving Lee without crucial reconnaissance on Union troop movements. Failure to seize high ground. On July 1st, Confederate forces pushed Union troops through Gettysburg, but Ewell hesitated to take Cemetery Hill, allowing the Union to fortify a strong defensive position. Pickett's charge. July 3rd, Lee ordered an all-out assault on the Union center, believing it was weak. The attack, led by General George Pickett, was a catastrophic failure, with Confederate forces suffering over 50% casualties. Outcome and impact. Lee's army was forced to retreat to Virginia, ending Confederate hopes of a successful Northern invasion. The battle marked the turning point of the Civil War, as the Confederacy never fully recovered from the losses suffered at Gettysburg. Lee took full responsibility for the failure, admitting, "It's all my fault." Final thoughts on Lee's legacy. Despite his brilliance on the battlefield, Lee's aggressive tactics often resulted in heavy casualties the Confederacy could not afford. His ability to inspire troops and execute complex maneuvers kept the South in the war longer than expected, but his strategic decisions, such as Pickett's charge, highlighted the limits of offensive warfare against a well-entrenched and numerically superior enemy. Thomas Stonewall Jackson, the fearless tactician. Shenandoah Valley Campaign, 1862, a masterclass in mobility and strategy. In the spring of 1862, Major General Thomas Stonewall Jackson led one of the most remarkable military campaigns of the American Civil War, the Shenandoah Valley Campaign. Outnumbered nearly 3-1 by Union forces, Jackson relied on speed, deception, and aggressive maneuvering to achieve stunning victories. The Union's goal was to capture the Shenandoah Valley, a key agricultural region that supplied the Confederate Army with food and resources. To achieve this, Union commanders devised a plan involving multiple armies converging on Jackson's smaller force. However, Jackson, with his 17,000 troops of the Army of the Valley, outmaneuvered the disjointed Union forces, forcing them to react to his unpredictable movements. In a series of rapid marches covering nearly 650 miles in just under 48 days, Jackson's army struck hard at different Union detachments before they could unite against him. His victories at Front Royal, May 23rd, Winchester, May 25th, Cross Keys, June 8th, and Port Republic, June 9th, left Union forces in disarray. Despite being pursued by over 50,000 Union troops, he kept them off balance and ultimately prevented them from reinforcing General George McClellan's offensive against Richmond, the Confederate capital. Jackson's success in the Valley cemented his reputation as one of the most brilliant tacticians of the war. His ability to move his troops swiftly, earning them the nickname Jackson's Foot Cavalry, and strike with precision made him a feared opponent. His campaign in the Shenandoah Valley demonstrated how a smaller force could defeat a larger one through superior leadership, speed, and battlefield awareness. Chancellorsville, 1863, a daring flank attack and a tragic end. The Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863 is often considered General Robert E. Lee's greatest victory, but it was Jackson's bold tactics that made it possible. Facing a Union army of 130,000 men under General Joseph Hooker, Lee and Jackson commanded only 60,000 troops. Despite being outnumbered more than 2-1, they refused to retreat. Jackson proposed an audacious plan. Instead of a frontal assault, he would lead 30,000 Confederate troops on a 12-mile flanking march through dense woods to attack the Union right flank, which was thought to be secure. The march was treacherous. Soldiers had to navigate narrow trails and swamps while maintaining absolute secrecy. On May 2, 1863, Jackson's forces emerged from the wilderness and launched a surprise attack on the Union 11 Corps, completely overwhelming them. The attack sent Union troops fleeing in confusion, causing a complete collapse of their right flank. Hooker's army, despite its superior numbers, was thrown into chaos, and the battle turned in the Confederates' favor. That night, while scouting ahead of his lines to plan the next phase of the attack, Jackson's reconnaissance party was mistakenly fired upon by his own men from the 18th North Carolina Infantry. He was struck 3 times, 2 bullets shattered his left arm, and another struck his right hand. His wounds led to the amputation of his arm, and while he initially seemed to recover, he soon developed pneumonia. On May 10, 1863, Jackson died at a plantation near Guinea Station, Virginia. His final words, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees," became legendary. Jackson's death was a devastating loss to the Confederacy. General Lee, upon hearing the news, stated, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." His leadership at Chancellorsville had helped secure a stunning Confederate victory, but his absence would be deeply felt in the battles that followed, including Gettysburg. Legacy of Stonewall Jackson. Jackson's legacy endures as one of the most skilled and daring military tacticians in American history. His ability to use terrain, speed, and surprise gave the Confederacy some of its greatest victories. Even in death, his legend lived on, inspiring soldiers and shaping military strategy for generations. James Longstreet, the Reluctant Warrior. Chickamauga, September 1863, the orchestrated Confederate victory. By the summer of 1863, the tide of war was shifting, and the Confederate Army faced mounting pressure on multiple fronts. In the Western Theater, General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee was engaged in a desperate struggle to reclaim lost ground in Georgia after being forced to abandon Chattanooga to Major General William Rosecrans' Union forces. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, recognizing the dire situation, turned to General James Longstreet, one of Robert E. Lee's most trusted and capable subordinates in the Army of Northern Virginia. Though Longstreet had long been an advocate for shifting the war's focus westward to relieve pressure on the Confederacy, he was reluctant to leave Lee's side. Nevertheless, duty called. With Lee's consent, Longstreet and his First Corps embarked on a grueling 800-mile journey by rail, one of the largest troop movements of the war, to reinforce Bragg's struggling forces near Chickamauga Creek. A critical moment in the Western Theater. By the time Longstreet arrived on September 19, 1863, Bragg's army had been engaged in fierce combat with Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland. The battlefield was a dense forested terrain, making coordination and visibility difficult for both sides. The fighting had been inconclusive, with the Union forces maintaining their defensive positions but showing signs of exhaustion. On the night of September 19th, Bragg divided his army into two wings, placing General Leonidas Polk in command of the right and Longstreet in charge of the left. The decision signified a major shift in Bragg's command structure and reflected his trust in Longstreet's ability to deliver a decisive blow. The breakthrough, Longstreet's assault. At dawn on September 20th, the battle resumed. As fate would have it, a grave mistake on the Union side presented Longstreet with a rare opportunity. Miscommunication within Rosecrans' command structure led him to believe that a gap had formed in his own defensive line. In a catastrophic error, he ordered troops to reposition, unintentionally creating an actual gap near the Union center. Longstreet, a master of battlefield tactics, immediately recognized the weakness. Without hesitation, he directed his men, divisions under John Bell Hood and Bushrod Johnson, to charge directly into the exposed Union line. The assault was swift and devastating. Union troops were caught off guard and overwhelmed by the relentless Confederate advance. The breach widened as Longstreet's troops poured through, causing chaos in the Federal ranks. Rosecrans, witnessing the disaster unfold, mistakenly believed his entire army was collapsing and retreated to Chattanooga, effectively removing himself from the battlefield. The Union right crumbled, and a full-scale rout ensued. Only a heroic last stand by Major General George H. Thomas, later known as the Rock of Chickamauga, prevented the complete destruction of the Union Army. As night fell, the battle ended with a Confederate victory, the most significant in the Western Theater. Aftermath and strategic consequences. While Chickamauga was a resounding tactical success, it ultimately failed to yield the strategic results the Confederacy desperately needed. Bragg, instead of aggressively pursuing the retreating Union forces and reclaiming Chattanooga, hesitated. Longstreet, frustrated by Bragg's indecisiveness, urged him to press the advantage, but Bragg's leadership faltered. The Confederate high command soon became embroiled in bitter infighting. Longstreet's frustrations with Bragg reached a breaking point, leading to a damaging rift between the two generals. Unable to work effectively with Bragg, Longstreet was reassigned to conduct an ill-fated campaign in East Tennessee, removing him from the immediate aftermath of Chickamauga. Meanwhile, the Union, under Ulysses S. Grant's leadership, reinforced Chattanooga and launched a decisive counteroffensive 2 months later. The Battle of Chattanooga, November 1863, saw the Confederates pushed out of the city, nullifying their victory at Chickamauga. The reluctant warrior. Longstreet's role at Chickamauga demonstrated his ability as a battlefield tactician, but it also highlighted the complex nature of his military career. Though he had been instrumental in securing one of the Confederacy's last great victories, his personal reluctance about the war's direction and his growing frustrations with Confederate leadership left him disillusioned. The infighting that followed Chickamauga ultimately weakened the Confederate war effort, marking another turning point in the long and bloody conflict. Despite his battlefield successes, Longstreet would always be remembered as a general who, though loyal to his cause, struggled with the realities of Confederate politics and the limitations of its leadership. Chickamauga was both a triumph and a tragedy, one that underscored the fleeting nature of Confederate victories in the face of an increasingly organized and determined Union war machine. The rise of a cavalry legend. Stuart's early Civil War service was marked by his daring reconnaissance missions and rapid cavalry movements. He served under General Joseph E. Johnston and later became the cavalry commander for General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. His ability to gather intelligence, harass Union supply lines, and execute surprise raids became a crucial component of Confederate strategy. His famed ride around McClellan in June 1862, during the Peninsula Campaign, demonstrated his exceptional leadership. Stuart and his cavalry completed a full circuit around Union General George B. McClellan's army, gathering intelligence and disrupting communications. This audacious maneuver cemented his status as a master of cavalry warfare and earned him national fame. Brandy Station, 1863, the largest cavalry battle of the war. On June 9, 1863, the Battle of Brandy Station took place in Virginia, marking the largest cavalry engagement of the American Civil War. The battle involved nearly 20,000 cavalrymen, with Union forces under General Alfred Pleasonton launching a surprise attack on Stuart's cavalry division. The battle began at dawn when Union forces crossed the Rappahannock River and caught Stuart's men off guard. However, Stuart quickly organized a counteroffensive. For hours, the two sides clashed in a chaotic melee of saber fights and mounted charges. The Confederate cavalry, though initially surprised, managed to repel the Union forces after intense fighting. While Stuart technically won the battle, it exposed vulnerabilities in his command, leading to criticism that his cavalry had become complacent. Brandy Station signified a turning point in cavalry warfare, as Union horsemen proved they could match the legendary Confederate cavalry in direct combat. The battle set the stage for future engagements in the Gettysburg Campaign and marked the decline of Stuart's invincibility in the eyes of both his men and his adversaries. Gettysburg and the controversy of 1863. Stuart's most controversial campaign occurred during the Gettysburg Campaign in June-July 1863. Ordered by Lee to screen the Confederate Army and report on Union movements, Stuart embarked on an extended raid deep into Union territory. While he captured supplies and disrupted Federal lines, his absence deprived Lee of critical intelligence before the Battle of Gettysburg. By the time Stuart rejoined Lee's army on July 2, the battle was already underway. Lee, lacking crucial cavalry reports, had engaged Union forces without full knowledge of their positioning. Although Stuart's cavalry fought bravely on the battle's third day, their late arrival contributed to the Confederate defeat. Stuart faced criticism for his decisions, with some arguing that his desire for personal glory had compromised the Army's effectiveness. The Overland Campaign and Stuart's final ride. In May 1864, during the Overland Campaign, Stuart faced Union General Philip Sheridan, a formidable cavalry leader determined to neutralize Confederate cavalry superiority. The two clashed at the Battle of Yellow Tavern on May 11, 1864. Despite his tactical brilliance, Stuart was outnumbered and forced into a defensive position. During the battle, Stuart was mortally wounded by a Union trooper's pistol shot. He was taken to Richmond, where he succumbed to his injuries on May 12, 1864. His death was a devastating blow to the Confederate cavalry, and General Lee mourned him as one of the South's finest officers. Epilogue: the war's end and its legacy. The Civil War resulted in over 620,000 deaths, a permanently altered political landscape, and the abolition of slavery. The military leaders who fought in it left lasting legacies, some as heroes, others as cautionary tales. Stuart remains a subject of debate among historians. While admired for his daring exploits, his overconfidence and controversial decisions at Gettysburg remain points of contention. Stuart's legacy endures as one of the most famous cavalry commanders in American history. His flamboyant persona, battlefield charisma, and tactical ingenuity continue to be studied in military circles. His contributions to cavalry tactics, reconnaissance, and the use of mounted troops in warfare left an indelible mark on military strategy. The lessons of Stuart's life, his boldness, leadership, and the consequences of overreaching ambition serve as a lasting testament to the complexity of wartime command. His story remains a compelling chapter in the broader history of the Civil War, reflecting both the triumphs and tragedies of a divided nation. Conclusion: the major contributions of both the North and South in the Civil War battles. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields, the immense contributions of both the North and South had left an undeniable mark on history. The Union's industrial power, vast rail networks, and naval superiority played a crucial role in sustaining their war effort, while the South's skilled military leadership, defensive strategies, and unwavering determination shaped some of the most hard-fought battles of the war. From the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg to the relentless campaigns in the Western Theater, each side fought with conviction, believing in their cause. The sacrifices made, the strategies employed, and the innovations developed during these brutal years forever changed the landscape of warfare and the course of American history. In the end, the war's conclusion would bring about a reunited nation, but at a cost so great that its echoes still resonate today. The legacies of those who fought, both for the preservation of the Union and for the ideals of the Confederacy, remain a pivotal chapter in the story of the United States. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, and subscribe to CyberTheo.